I believe we're going to hear from Professor Leone about research related to this project, and I'm going to say a little bit about it too. But first, I want to give you some sense of the scope of his research and its international and interdisciplinary nature. Here's where visiting professorships, research fellowships, and honorary appointments have taken Massimo Leone over the past 10 years. Paris in 2013-14 as visiting professor at the Sorbonne, on to China, then to Germany, back to France, back to Germany, to Japan, to the UK, to Romania, to the US, to Austria, back to China, to Uruguay, back to Germany, to Croatia, Poland, back to Paris. And next year, he'll be a visiting fellow at CRASH, the University of Cambridge Center for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences, and Humanities. You may detect some envy along with admiration in my listing of Professor Leone's many fellowships and visiting professorships or visiting positions, but I describe these international appointments not so much to give you his travel schedule as to underscore the international reach and the collaborative ambition of Professor Leone's research. I would also stress its fundamental interdisciplinarity. Massimo Leone received a laurea in communications from the University of Siena, a DEA in semiology and history of text from the University of Paris, an MPhil in philosophy from Trinity College, Dublin, a first doctorate in art history from the University of Fribourg, and a second in religious studies from the Sorbonne. So by training, and I'm guessing by temperament, Massimo Leone is a capacious thinker who pushes disciplinary limits, who brings together diverse modes and methods of research, who thinks transdisciplinarily, transnationally, and across historical periods. His many books, I think 13, but I might have lost count. His many books reveal a broad range of interests held together by a consistent attention to cultural semiotics. From his earliest work on the semiotics of religious conversion and spiritual change to investigations of digital spirituality, to his most recent work on faces, on digital visual cultures, and on the semiotics of the digital face. This research investigates semiotic ideologies at the crossroads of material and digital cultures, and it offers theoretical frameworks for modeling, among other things, notions of self and other in semiotic terms. For me, in my very partial reading of his vast oeuvre, a compelling example of this work is found in a recent essay entitled On Muzzles and Faces, The Semiotic Limits of Visage and Personhood from 2020. Here, Professor Leone investigates, as he puts it, the anthropological concept of personhood from the point of view of the dialectics between two fundamental elements of social, cultural, linguistic, and semiotic construction of the self-identity of the human species. On the one hand, the human face, and on the other, the non-human muzzle. Calling on etymology, semantic analysis, and philosophy, Professor Leone offers a dazzling rereading of Levinas on the ethics of the face, of Deleuze and Guattari on visagité, and of Derrida on animality. And he critiques the identification of the visage as the location of human, non-human intersubjectivity, defined as the ability to see the other as a subject and to see oneself as an other for an other, a subject for another subject. The being constituted by the visage is eminently semiotic, he argues, and the human visage cannot escape the asymmetries that define it against the animal's muzzle. This definition operates through sacrificial logic, he argues, and it persists even in those thinkers who would recognize the non-human animal as having a visage. My brief summary can only hint at the powerful analysis that thinking about the semiotics of the visage opens up in Professor Leone's essay, but I would insist on the way that here, as elsewhere in his work, studying cultures of the face, or what he also calls the facosphere, opens compelling questions about recognition, about ethics, about subjectivity, and about cultural meaning. This work is at the center of Professor Leone's current collaborative research. For several years, he has directed the European Research Council-funded collaborative project called Facets, as I mentioned earlier. Facets investigates the ubiquitous practices of face exhibition in social media, along with practices of masking the face in anti-establishment political activism, for example, or in anti-surveillance artistic provocations. Facets sponsors collective and collaborative research that combines visual history, semiotics, phenomenology, visual anthropology, and face perception studies. And it also includes the collection, analysis, and social contextualization of big data, all with the goal of studying cultural and technological manifestations of change in modes and affects of self-perception and communicative interaction. We now have the opportunity to learn more about this research on faces. Please join me in welcoming Massimo Leone for a lecture on the nose of Pinocchio.
Well, thank you very much for this wonderful presentation, and thank you for the marvelous opportunity to be with you all, albeit only virtually. So let me try to share my screen. Hopefully there's not going to be any technical problems. Ok, so Le avventure di Pinocchio, storia di un burattino by Carlo Lorenzini, aka Carlo Collodi, is famous worldwide. Pinocchio's best known feature is his nose, which stretches out when he tells lies. This appears in chapter 17 of The Adventures of Pinocchio. Collodi wrote often on faces, noses, and masks. In 1881, he published a collection of articles he had written for Italian journals. The collection was entitled Occhi e Nasi, Eyes and Noses. In another collection, Note Gaie, Joyous Notes, edited posthumously by Giuseppe Rigutini in 1892, Collodi writes, I believe, and I have always believed, that the mask is the perfection of the human race. Perhaps Buffon does not think like me, but his natural history is quite obsolete, especially after the marvelous progresses recently made by the sciences in general, and in particular as regards papier-mâché noses, end of quote. The subsequent paragraphs propose an ironic history of the ancient mask. Collodi then refers back to the present. In these days, someone else has engaged in solving a very serious and very profound problem, the problem of knowing whether a free population might be allowed to add its own nose to its own nose, another papier-mâché nose, and to hide the mirror of the soul, a poetical sentence to ennoble the word meso, with a conspicuously appearing morettina, end of quote. Morettina is an Italian word for the typical Venetian mask, which covers the nose and the upper part of the face. It was so called because it was originally dark, usually black. Collodi then concludes, as far as I'm concerned, so as not to rack my brain with problems, I declare right now that the first right of a free citizen is that of being able to don a mask in all season, and even in the season of political elections. And if voters will complain, too bad for them. This is the world now, and fortunately, I was not the one who made it. End of quotation. Collodi did not make the world, but he made Pinocchio. He made him, with a peculiar feature, a growing nose. In Pinocchio, however, the relation between nose and lying is not straightforward. The nose starts growing when it is first carved by Geppetto, before Pinocchio lies. After the eyes, it was time to carve the nose, which began to stretch as soon as finished. It began to grow and grow and grow till it became so long it seemed endless. Poor Geppetto kept cutting it, but the more he cut, the longer grew that impertinent nose. In despair, he let it alone. End of quote. The nose then appears a couple of times in the story. It stretches out when Pinocchio lies. After the boy is struggling and weeping over his deformed nose, the blue fairy summons woodpeckers to peck it back to normal. The stretching nose has been variously interpreted. There are theological, esoteric, even Freemason interpretations of Pinocchio. Giorgio Agamben's latest book is about Pinocchio. The Italian philosopher, too, underlines the inconsistent relation between stretching nose and lying. I quote, "It is important not to forget that the growth of the nose is not necessarily a symptom of lies. When the demiurge, after having made the big wooden eyes of occhiacci di legno, fabricates the nose, as soon as it was made, it started to grow and grew and grew and grew until it became an endless nose." End of quotation from Agamben. According to Agamben, I quote again, "The nose is the expression of the incorrigible, picaresque insolence of Pinocchio, and only secondarily of his equally picaresque knavery." End of quotation. In the Italian philosopher's interpretation, Pinocchio's lying is physiological, linked to its indeterminable character and to the vagueness of an existence that, as a consequence, can only be indefectibly failed. The endless nose of Pinocchio is his truth. Agamben concludes, I quote, "Truth is not an axiom established once for all. It grows and dwindles at a glance, together with life, to the point of becoming more and more cumbersome and difficult for those who adhere to it without reservation, like the nose of Pinocchio, indeed." End of quote. Agamben certainly refers to Italo Calvino's interpretation of Pinocchio as the only true picaresque character in Italian literature. But he, Agamben, also reads Pinocchio's nose as the element of a moral allegory. So does also the US philosopher Martin W. Clancy. In the 2015 article for the New Yorker, "What the Original Pinocchio Really Says About Lying." In his interpretation of Pinocchio's nose, Clancy refers to Rousseau as regards the boy's innate insolence, and to German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer's notion of living truth as regards Pinocchio's lying. I quote, "Bonhoeffer argues that it is naive and misleading, perhaps even dangerous, to suppose that the literal truth always or even typically conveys what we mean when we talk about telling the truth. Of course, we often tell a straightforward lie, and for morally blameworthy reasons, but we also often make statements that are not literally true, that are in fact literal lies, while conveying a deeper truth that an honest statement of the facts could not communicate." End of quote. Clancy is also the editor of an Oxford University Press collection of essays entitled "The Philosophy of Deception." published in 2009. It includes a chapter by Paul Ekman on eye-catching and micro-expressions. Ekman became world famous thanks to the fact that the face of human beings does not behave like the face of Pinocchio. When humans lie, their noses do not grow. Yet Ekman became famous also because he argues that human faces are not entirely different from Pinocchio's. When humans lie, Ekman claims, something in their face often changes. The change is involuntary and uncontrollable. Therefore, it can be read as a sign of lying. But Ekman also stresses that this sign is no univocal. Not all involuntary facial microexpressions are symptoms of lying, and not all lies give rise to involuntary microexpressions. Ekman's method to read them has been successfully marketed to privates and institutions, including intelligence services. The US TV series Lie to Me is inspired by his method. Yet Ekman's research is also philosophical. Like Agamben's and Clancy's commentaries on Pinocchio, it bears on the philosophy of lying. More specifically, it inquires into the place of lying in the evolution of the human species. Why are human faces able to simulate inner states? Why are they able to dissimulate them? And why are such simulation and dissimulation almost always imperfect? What determines the degrees of such imperfection? And how was all that adaptive throughout evolution? Are human faces like masks? Is their correspondence with the inside always partial? Umberto Eco, the founder of Italian semiotics, defines semiotics as the discipline that studies everything that can be used to lie. Mirrors, for instance, he claims in an essay, are not semiotic objects because they never lie. If they do, like those that make people look slimmer, they do so always according to the same rule. In the above-mentioned note, Collodi refers to the face as to the mirror of the soul. It is a very old metaphor. The reference is nevertheless ironic. Whereas mirrors cannot lie, faces can. Collodi even argues that the real truth of faces is in their masks. Since masks do not change, the lie they tell turns into a sort of truth. According to Eco's definition, masks are semiotic objects. Differently from mirrors, they can be used to lie. They can be donned to make a face appear what is not. Yet they usually do so according to a code. That is why, paradoxically, they can be more reassuring than faces. They are easier to decode. Are faces semiotic objects too? Yes and no. They can be used for lying, for sure. Yet, as Ekman points out, when the face works as a mask, such mask is always imperfect. Something in it cannot be completely controlled. The reason is simple. Unlike the mask, the face is a living biological device. It is not made of wood like Pinocchio, but of living flesh. Professionals of facial simulation, like actors and actresses, and of facial dissimulation, like poker masters, perfect the control of their faces. Yet this control is always imperfect. There is no one-to-one correspondence between how we want our face to look and how it does look. There cannot be. The reason might lie, sorry for the childish illustration, it was the only one that really captured the idea that I'm going to talk about. The reason might lie in the natural evolution of the human face. Before being a visage, the human face was probably just a head. It was part of the body in quick contact with the brain through sensorial organs. They were, and still are, concentrated on the surface of our head. Eyes, ears, mouth, nose, a quite sensitive part of the skin. Touch is the only sense whose biological device is distributed along the human body, coextensive with the skin. The other organs are conveniently placed close to the brain in a narrow area that is easy to protect. Yet, this concentration impacts on self-perception. We can touch our skin and taste our mouth. Under certain conditions, we can smell our nostrils and hear the sounds that our ears produce, although it is not usually a good sign. But there is no way to see our own eyes. Moreover, there is no way to see our own face. The most we perceive of it is the contour of our eyes, the tip of our nose, the tip of our tongue and lips if we make an effort. Hence, the face, well, this is Michelangelo, a little bit more academic. Hence, the face is a non-cybernetic device. The hand is. We can look at our hands and adjust them to the environment. But the adjustment of the face to the world is always indirect. It must rely on, first, a very limited proprioception. I think that my face is looking the way I think, but I might be wrong. In a selfie, we never look as we thought we would while taking it. Second, the face of the other. We know what face we have, what face we make, and what face we are through observing the reactions to it on other people's faces. Yet that does not solve the riddle that complicates it. Does my interlocutor reliably mirror my face? Is that just a simulation, a dissimulation? If I'm not sure about the face I show, how can I be sure about other people showing their faces to mine? The face is, therefore, a Bakhtiinian device. It is always dialogical. Even alone in the desert, my face is quintessentially for another face. Yet this other face, this face of mine is always a mystery. As it was stated before, there is no complete human decoding of the face. That is a limit, but also a guarantee. Emmanuel Levinas famously founded his ethics on the visage. Since it cannot be completely decoded, it cannot be completely encoded either. It is a place of uncertainty, but also a place of freedom. It intrinsically reminds me that the other is not another me, but another I. The other is not an object, but a subject whose face is unpredictable. Subsequent philosophers sought to expand the principle. Deleuze and Guattari, Derrida, Haraway, Kocha. Progressively, we realized that other living beings also have a face and not only a muzzle. Progressively, we also realized that our face too is a muzzle, as Collodi ironically thought, a natural muzzle beneath a cultural mask that we call our face. Anthropology joins philosophy in showing the limits of the face. In some cultures, the tuareg, for instance, veiling the face is the norm, unveiling it the exception. The non-cybernetic nature of the face, its invisibility, its unpredictability, is probably a social outcome of natural evolution. In the beginning, there was maybe just a head with a muzzle. Yet something at some stage changed. 7 million years ago with Sahelanthropus, as some scholars claim, or about 12 million years ago with Danuvius gugemosi, as other scholars claim, our biological ancestors began to turn bipedal and to look not downwards, but straight ahead and even upwards. Morphological alterations of the human skeleton ensued. They included changes to the arrangement and size of the bones of the foot, hip size and shape, knee size, leg length, and the shape and orientation of the vertebral column. The erect position of the head liberated the prominent supraorbital ridges and their strong muscular attachments from the task of sustaining the head. Bipedalism made our heads lighter and our faces more motile and exposed to the faces of other members of the species. Gravity started to exert its force, not perpendicular, but parallel to our faces. Muscles of the forehead that were theretofore used to sustain the skull adapted to other functions, like frowning. As soon as we stood up, we humans started to frown. The social consequences of a face liberated from gravity were huge. The face ceased to be just a part of the head where sensorial organs concentrate. It ceased to be just a muzzle. It became instead the primary affordance of life. Our mating position changed. Maybe that's when we started to kiss. Human beings became very skilled at spotting faces in the environment. Seeing faces meant seeing where other living beings, their sensorial organs were. It was important to prey on them and not to be preyed on by them. The right fusiform area of the human brain became specifically devoted to perceiving faces in the environment. This function is so deep-seated that we are doomed to see faces, even if they cannot possibly be there. We see faces in clouds, in rocks. As soon as a visual pattern looks like a face, we recognize it as such. It is pareidolia. Sometimes it can be pathological, like in the Charles Bonnet syndrome, or as an effect of LSD. Yet pareidolia exists because it has been adaptive. Our ancestors were better be mistaken in seeing the face of a predator or of a prey that was not there than in not seeing one that was. Seeing faces became crucial for survival. It also became crucial for interaction among members of the species. This is a very grotesque gadget. You can have muzzles in the shape of faces for your dogs. Sorry for this image. It also became crucial for interaction among members of the species. Language and face probably co-evolved. Together, they gave rise to a fundamental watershed. Humans started to unsee the faces of other animals as faces. They started to see them as muzzles. They also started to differentiate faces and muzzles in human languages. A face is a head of organs one can have social intercourse with. A muzzle is a head of organs to avoid or to eat or to enslave. A face is also a mouth, yet it is mainly a linguistic mouth. It is a mouth that speaks and does not bite. It is a mouth that kisses. It might eat, but only muzzles, not other faces. Seeing other animals as muzzles and not as faces allowed us to eat them and not to eat each other. It still does, unfortunately, for the poor muzzles around us. This is a vegan personal comment. A face is also a mouth and a nose, but it is predominantly two eyes. What humans recognize as face in the face of other humans is exactly the part of it that can in turn recognize their own face as such. An encounter between faces is an encounter between gazes. All Indo-European languages underline the visual definition of the face as visage. Most non-Indo-European languages do so too. When faces are not conceived as visages, they start to be considered as muzzles. When muzzles are considered as faces, it is because they are considered as visages. Pets have faces, not only muzzles, because we see their visages and we think they see ours. Derrida realized it. Facing naked is naked cat. Humanizing entails envisaging. Yet the opposite is true too. Dehumanizing entails defacing. The Nazis represented Jews as animals with monstrous muzzles, as defaced animals. Deleuze and Guattari stressed it. The visage, is also a machine of normalization, a machine of visagité. It is the primary interface of social acceptability and unacceptability, inclusion and exclusion. The inclusivity of a society is also facial. To what extent are its members ready to recognize the faces of others as visages and not simply as faces or even as muzzles. In racist societies, a wrong pigmentation is sufficient to turn a face into a muzzle. But on the opposite, the machine of visageité can be used to attribute a face to faceless and even to inorganic objects in design, for instance. We can feel our absent face, we can guess it from the faces of others, but we can also make it present through representations. Mirrors are a recent invention of the humankind. For a very long time, faces could be reflected only into opaque surfaces such as water or metal. Visual representations of faces are older than mirrors, yet they are not the oldest representations. Bataille speculated that in cave painting, representing the face was a taboo. That is difficult to ascertain. Yet, the Greek myth of painting associates representing faces with both death and love. Pliny the Elder tells the story in the Natural History. A potter's daughter was in distress. Her lover was leaving for the war. The night before, the two were in the same room, lit by a lamp. The girl took a chalk and outlined the shadow of the boy's profile on the wall. According to the myth, that was the first portrait. It was a profile portrait. It was modeled after shadow. It was a gesture of both fear and love. The face might soon be gone. The portrait is meant to stay in remembrance. The face is a melting pot of questions. No discipline, this is my group in Turin, at the University of Turin, my team. No discipline alone can address them all. In my ERC project Facets, I concentrate on the digital shift. The face too goes digital. In representations, we can now capture, store, modify, assemble, and display images of faces with multiple devices. Digital images of faces can be post-produced in unprecedented ways. Deep fakes are just at their beginning. In interactions, more and more, we do not meet faces, we meet their digital images, like the digital image of my own face. I'm sorry about that. The pandemic has accentuated this trend. Furthermore, our faces are increasingly seen by non-human agents endowed with artificial intelligence. Facial recognition is rampant. Vice versa, we see an increasing number of fictional digital faces in ultra-realistic video games, in robotics. The uncanny valley gets smaller and smaller. We also interact with machine-made digital faces made by GANs, the generative adversarial networks, the new digital forgers. No Morelli's method seems to work against them. Finally, the face goes digital in proprioception too, through a variety of digital face enhancements, epidermal electronics, under-skin chips, cyber glasses, transhuman devices. We can now see our own face in deepfake virtual reality experiments and interact with it. Yet, as the popular opinion and the grey press are awed by all this novelty, we scholars should doubt, play the devil's advocate. Is the digital really changing the face? Is this change radical? Is it so different from past changes? Are we not perhaps hypnotized by the present? Today, it is hard to believe it, but smiling faces are not so old. According to some scholars, they are a product of modern dentistry. Before the 18th century, smiling was frowned upon in most circumstances. It was deemed as undignified. It would show rotten teeth. The birth of the smiling face in 18th century post-revolutionary Paris was also a revolution. Yet it was not digital at all. Is the digital changing our faces as deeply as modern dentistry? And are deep fakes so different from the countless forgeries and trompe-l'œil of art history? Is a selfie so incomparable with a portrait or with a mirror? And aren't GAN images just a secular version of akeiropoietai images, like the Holy Shroud? And what about automatic face recognition? Is it not just a version of the old panopticon? These are just some of the questions to be discussed. I'm going to deal with some of them in the few minutes that are left for my presentations. Between June 19th and September 27, 2020, the Carré d'Art Museum of Contemporary Art in Nîmes, France, proposed an exhibition entitled Faces, des Visages, with the subtitle The Time of the Other, Le Temps de l'Autre. The human face was thematized through the presentation of several artistic works, ranging from Christian Boltanski to Sophie Calle, from Thomas Ruff to Ugo Rondinone. And like many exhibitions in the same period around the world, this one too was intended as a reaction through the museum to the confinement and masking caused by the current pandemic. In these times of confinement, where anyone could seem to be a threat and where we advance masked, this exhibition, made up largely of works from the collection, leads us to look at the other. This was the slogan of the exhibition. The poster for Nîmes exhibition contained an image from a video installation by African-American artist Martin Sims, whose work often focuses on the face as a site of identity and conflict in US society. The exhibition was obviously influenced or even motivated by the urgency to reflect on a very quotidian yet mysterious object, namely the face, after the lockdowns caused by the spread of the COVID-19 virus. During the pandemic, in fact, the face was challenged from several perspectives in its anthropological status and its deep semiotic functioning, the difficulty or even the impossibility of meeting the other face-to-face, the imposition of the mask, the forced digitalization of the face in professional, social, and intimate life. All of these dynamics imposed a rapid and pressing reconsideration of what was previously consubstantially and literally naturalized as being in front of everyone's eyes, that is, the face. The exhibition in Nîmes chose to highlight a sentence from the philosopher of the face par excellence of the 20th century, Emmanuel Levinas, and precisely, oh, by the way, my team too had to comply with the norms. We created some facets, face masks. Emmanuel Levinas, and precisely a passage from the work Ethics and Infinity, the result of a series of interviews with Levinas conducted by the French philosopher Philippe Nemo and published in the paperback collection by Fayard in 1982, since translated into some 15 languages. Levinas' sentence, which was the main theme of the exhibition in Nîmes, read as follows. The best way, I quote, to meet someone is not to notice the color of their eyes. When you observe the color of your eyes, you're not in a social relationship with another person. The relationship with the face can certainly be dominated by perception, but what is specifically face is that which is not reduced to it, end of quote. The quote is particularly relevant in two ways. On the one hand, on the surface, it is both a metaphorical and literal node to the political question of the face and its pigmentations, emphasized, moreover, by the choice of Martin Sims' image in the poster. Almost at the same time that the world was partially covering the faces of men and women in an attempt to hinder the spread of the virus, a movement of opinion spread globally, propelled by the violent death of African-American citizen George Floyd at the hands of a white police officer. This movement thematized the social and political role of skin color, but at the same time, it focused on the face and the mouth in particular as a channel for breathing suffocated by police brutality. The two social circumstances, both focused on the face and especially the mouth, have since often intersected in public discourse, for instance, in the exhibition at the Carré d'Art. On the other hand, Levinas's phrase has nevertheless revealed another, deeper relevance, which could be described as the ethical phenomenology of the face. In the typical style of the Franco-Lithuanian thinker, the quotation seems to describe what happened in perception when the face of the other was masked to protect it from contagion or to protect itself from contagion. The nose and mouth being covered, as well as most of the lower part of the face, what came to the forefront in the masked face to masked face encounter was precisely their upper part, that of the eyes, with an anatomy detailed by the forced circumstances of the phenomenology of the emergency, and hence the attribution of a brand new meaning to both their form and their function. Individual psychology, but also anthropological cultures of the face can contribute to making this visual exaltation of the eyes in the masked face particularly striking or even embarrassing, for example, in individuals or in whole societies that talk to each other while looking not into the eyes, but towards the mouth or towards the body. In this case, looking into someone's eyes has negative connotations related, for example, to defiance. Beyond the differences of a cognitive, psychological, social, cultural, and contextual nature, which make the occultation of the mouth more or less detrimental to communication, the mask generally hinders the ocular, phenomenological, and semiotic relationship to others. This often leads to a series of rehabilitation micro-tactiques that attempt to use other visual elements from the visible regions of the face, especially the eye regions, as well as postural, gestural, and contextual cues to compensate for the lack of visual information caused by the mask. Some of these strategies are even being modeled in order to develop new algorithms and automatic facial recognition devices. Finally, my iPhone recognizes me with a face mask on. Levinas's observation, quoted by the Nîmes exhibition, has, however, a more general meaning. The face is a biological entity and presents itself through a physical morphology, but its phenomenological functioning, as well as the very complex semiotics that derives from it, requires that wholeness which the philosopher of totality and infinity makes a pillar of his ethics. When the face is perceived not in terms of totality, but in terms of fragmentation, its ethical value is endangered. This is the case when it is apprehended not as a singularity, but as an occurrence, as a token of a type, as we would say in linguistics. This philosophical and ethical demand is, however, in tension with a whole series of approaches to faces, which on the contrary tend to fit them in, to measure them, to categorize them. How can we develop an anatomical study of the face and make it an object of science without emphasizing the aspects that several faces have in common in their structure? How can we explore the cognition of the face without trying to standardize the lines of perception? How can we resist the urge to find clues to a typology of personalities? And how can we develop an automatic reading of faces that is not parametrized? The objectification of the face is of crucial importance in all domains of social life, from interpersonal interaction to the recognition of civic identity when protecting territories and borders. Yet, it is exactly in these domains and in these occasions of measuring and controlling faces that their uniqueness is undermined, humiliated, mortified. The idea of the quantification of faces immediately returns the memory to the harmful tradition of theories of race, so often entangled with the pseudo-scientific prejudices of colonial ethnography and positivist criminology. The quantitative classification of faces remains, however, a necessity for the sciences, including the semiotics of the face, which as a science cannot limit itself to an idealistic interpretation of the singularity of the face, but must instead probe the articulations of the language that underlies it, of the system that produces meaning in and with the face beyond its idiosyncrasies until reaching a level of analytical finesse that in fact eliminates the singularities or pushes the apprehension of them towards more and more superficial levels of the generation of meaning on the side of the accidental materiality of the faces or of their combinatory singularity. The naturalized American-Lebanese poet Khalil Gibran dedicated a short poem to the faces whose conclusion seems to point in the same direction. I've seen a face with 1,000 countenances, and a face that was but a single countenance as if held in a mold. I've seen a face whose sheen I could look through to the ugliness beneath, and a face whose sheen I had to lift to see how beautiful it was. I've seen an old face much lined with nothing, and a smooth face in which all things were graven. I know faces because I look through the fabric my own eyes weaves and behold the reality beneath, end of quote. This poem, as well as the above-mentioned quote from Levinas, seems to indicate that in the ethical encounter with the other, the appropriation of the other as an object and thus the violence towards his, her, their subjectivity often involves practices that deny the phenomenological totality of the face. For example, when one focuses on the anatomical details of the other's face, especially if they're not grasped in their singularity, but with a concern for categorization, the face of another then is no longer the surface of a singularity, but the beginning of a classification where the other is appropriated as an object, as it is categorized. Such is the biological and anthropological inheritance of singularity in the human face of all cultures and at all times, that any classification operation can constitute a kind of threat to this very inheritance. Sometimes in life, our face is compared to someone else's and judged to be similar. The fact that we are told that we look like a famous and handsome actor may even flatter us, but the suggestion that our face is an exact copy of another face, especially if it is an anonymous one, may, on the contrary, hurt us or even worry us, especially if the semiotic context requires, on the contrary, an exaltation of singularity, as in any supposedly loving interaction. Telling one's lover that his or her or their face looks exactly like that of a well-known actor or actress will not be received positively, since any discourse of comparison or classification of the face potentially undermines its singularity, or at least the social discourse that detects it. A semioethics of the face inspired by Levinas must then articulate the system of perceptual, cognitive, and material operations that threaten the totality of the face as a stronghold of singularity and its reception by the other. This articulation must also target the operations that, on the contrary, tend to exalt the singularity of the face in the phenomenology of its interactions. What must result is a kind of reasoning, both semiotic and ethical, about the face, about everything that can give rise to its homogenization, or on the contrary, can determine its collapse into even deeper layers of indistinction. Basically, to study the semiotics of the face is to study one of the most accomplished human attempts to emerge from the anonymity of nature by and through language, through the institution of the singularity of one's own face and that of others. Several phenomenologies of uniformity can undermine this project of anthropopoiesis, and the widely conceived ethics of the face can in turn espouse an ideology of distinction or work towards the depersonalization of the individual for multiple purposes. In any case, no human agent, no society, or no cultural project is as threatening to the ethical singularity of the face as nature itself. It is essentially against nature, in fact, that cultures try to assert the particularities of their faces. Nothing better than natural disasters reveals the essentially prosopoclastic destruction of faces, character of nature. This is about doubles in Saramago and, of course, in the film rendition. In 2004, and I will shortly conclude, a large part of the Indian Ocean coastline was devastated by a tsunami that ravaged mostly the poorest villages in the region, causing massacres. In 2006, the Sri Lankan American poet Indran Amirtayagam published the Splintered Face Tsunami Poems, a collection of poems in which he tried to elaborate a kind of poetic resilience against several forms of erasure, understood as an operation that aims at eliminating the human face or reducing it. The tsunami, in fact, annihilated entire stretches of coastline, but above all, it erased faces, causing thousands of nameless deaths. One of the central poems of the collection is entitled quite simply Face. It opens with the following lines. Imagine half your face wrapped out, yet you are suited up and walking to the office. How will your mates greet you with heavy hearts, flowers, rosary beads? How shall we greet the orphan boy, the husband, whose hand slipped, children and wife swept away? How to greet our new years and our birthdays? Shall we always light a candle? Do we remember the time erases the shore, grass grows, breaths modified? And again, near the conclusion of the poem, I do not know how to walk upon the beach, how to lift corpse after corpse until I am exhausted, how to stop the tears when half my face has been wrapped out beyond the railroad tracks, and this anesthetic, this calypso can to the last verse. What shall we write in the sand? End of quote. Natural disasters, as well as those that humans inflict upon each other in the mutual attempt to erase the face of an enemy people. We have an example now very close to Europe. A project that reaches its climax in genocide, for example, the Shoah, which is the basis of Levinas's philosophical experience, are essentially massive erasures of faces. Even the pandemic of COVID-19, which continues to ravage several regions of the planet, consists not only in the drama of the erasure of the faces of the living under the masks, but also in the tragedy of the erasure of the faces of the dying under the oxygen masks, in the anonymity of the mass graves, in that terrible image which no one can forget of the overflowing coffins leaving Bergamo in Italy on a line of tracks. Semioethics of the face must therefore consider this polarization between semiotic conditions that make it possible to cultivate the discursive illusion of the singularity of the human face, and conditions and operations that, on the contrary, ensure that it is diminished, that it fades away until it collapses into indistinction. The semiotics, especially in its most general aims, but even when applied to a particular case of studies, for example, that of the partial erasure of the face under medical masks, must not neglect, nevertheless, attention to its most general and profound ideological presuppositions. The project to erect the face as a bastion of singularity is very global, but it nevertheless has anthropological as well as cultural and historical roots. On the one hand, there are cultures increasingly in the minority in modernity where the primary function of the face is not that of being a perimeter of singularity. On the other hand, particularly in the context of a reflection of the human face in the era of the Anthropocene, we must not forget that the face is an inherently anthropocentric affordance, for the phenology of the human face is only possible if that of the non-human is simultaneously erased. The semiotics of the epiphany of the face, in fact, takes its meaning by contrast and by opposition to operations of occultation, which can assume multiple forms and dynamics, being essentially reduced to two phenomenological categories. On the one hand, the figurative compression of the singular face, namely the mask. On the other hand, the plastic repression of the singular face, namely the veil. Deleuze and Guattari tried to grasp the ultimate principle of the phenomenology of the face as visageness, as visageité, identifying it essentially in an original plastic structure composed of a pattern of protruding openings from an undistinct background. But let me conclude. The need to hide our face because of the pandemic shocked us. Especially in the West, the face is a rampart of singularity. The causes of the pandemic have not yet been precisely determined, but a hypothesis shared by several renowned scientists explains it as an effect of what could be called the excesses of the Anthropocene. By exceeding the anthropization of the planet, humans have upset the ecological balance between themselves, other animal species, and the virus. By multiplying our prey among non-human animals, we have become prey to their predators, that is, the viruses. We are, in a way, replacing other animals as targets of viruses. A pandemic probably caused by anthropocentrism has thus forced us to renounce, at least temporarily, the semiotic device that constructs the human phenomenological distinction, namely the face. We had to mask ourselves. Medical masks, however, in their design, in their phenomenology, in their functions, and in their semiotics, have implied a fragmentation of the plasticity of the face, and thus the difficulty, or even in some cases, the impossibility of tracing the path of visageité back to the social sanction, which in interlocution recognizes and makes recognized the singularity of the individual. The pandemic, the result of the violent way in which we humans muzzle other living beings, especially non-human animals, has muzzled us in turn. By dint of denying the faces of other living beings, we ended up with a denied face. We tried to react by redesigning the masks, imagining them transparent, technological, aestheticized by decorations, even by reproducing the underlying faces. However, especially after the emergency, when the pandemic will have dissipated, it will be rather by a new design, not of the masks, but of the faces that we will have to react. An ancestral lineage of prevarication and suffering has built the human face, which is what is due to the subjugation of all other living beings, fruit of the negation of the faces of other species. In order to reconstruct our own face after the pandemic, it is not enough to unmask it. The face of the living must be unmasked, it must be revealed. The true revelation must consist in the reversal of the myth of Isaac. The ram must be unveiled, freed from the muzzle, and above all, freed from the muzzle, recognized face, stopping its sacrifice. The Anthropocene is leading us to increasingly difficult living conditions, has inflicted us with a pandemic, for example. It is time, therefore, and it is urgent to replace it by a new epoch, which we could call prosopocene, from the Greek name for face. In this new era, Isaac, the one who laughs, will be the name of every animal finally freed from a millinery joke. It is necessary to stop the prosopophagy that is devastating the planet. It is necessary to recognize in all living beings the sparks of singularity, and it is also necessary to limit the hold of biotechnological power on the singularities of faces subjected to calculations, measurements, and controls. Let's replace the ram of sacrifice with plants cultivated with dignity, and the machines that erase the singularity of faces with devices that, on the contrary, exalt their uniqueness. This will be a new step towards our own liberation, towards our unveiling as a species that lives not only in the language that is proper to our species and perhaps to it alone, but also in the face through which we look at nature, through which nature looks at us. Thank you very much for your attention.
Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. Thank you for that marvelous lecture. That was absolutely wonderful, wonderfully wide-ranging. I guess my question is, what is the relation between the early part of the lecture in which you, oh, sorry, my name is Amanda Anderson. I direct the Kogut Institute for the Humanities at Brown University. What is the relation between the early section of the lecture in which you discussed truth and lying and the ultimate wonderfully kind of cascading set of theses at the end about the semioethics of the face, the Anthropocene, dehumanization, via denial of the singularity of the face and genocide, et cetera? What's the relationship between the really important aspects of truth and lying, the kind of yes and no answer that you gave to whether the face is semiotic, is a semiotic, entity, especially given the utter centrality of the question of truth to the contemporary political scene. The constant weaponization of claims, of fake news, and just the Pinocchio-like element of some of our major leaders. Thank you.
Thank you. This is a fantastic question because it allows me to actually connect the first part of my lecture to the last part. And I left them unconnected exactly because I somehow wanted to provoke the audience. We started from the consideration that is justified by the text itself of Pinocchio, that there is something paradoxical about Pinocchio's nose. Pinocchio's nose doesn't actually grow only when he lies, because Pinocchio's nose grows even before he has lied for the first time. And this is what Giorgio Agamben interprets as a hint to the fact that lying is somehow consubstantial to the nature of Pinocchio and to the human nature. But I would like to interpret this modern myth of Pinocchio in another way. The first originary lie of Pinocchio's myth and Pinocchio's story is the fact that he has a face emerging from the wood. The first originary lie is that our face can actually be distinguished from the wood. This is the consubstantial lie that somehow establishes all subsequent lies. The fact that a singularity divided from the singularity of nature, the singularity of a human face divided from the singularity of a trunk, emerges from this, that in the story, and in most interpretations is interpreted as inert and almost inorganic matter. We now start to believe that trees to communicate, trees to somehow have a face, trees have a singularity. So that's the first lie. The first lie is in the emergence of the human face in this violent dialectic way, denying the singularity and the face of nature. And I believe that this original lie is at the basis of all subsequent lies. We just reproduce towards other human beings the same originary violence that we have inflicted upon other human living species in order to construct the myth of our singularity.
Hi, Massimo. I'm Ranji, and Ranji Khanna, I corresponded with you. Thank you so much for this wonderful lecture. I like very much the way you responded to Amanda's question now, and I think that maybe this follows on in some ways, and if I might sort of draw out a pun that works in the English, as it were, that Pinocchio knows something that the land knows, or the tree knows, as it were, and not just the nose knows, as it were. But my question is about if you could sort of draw out a little bit more a question around the ethico-political. You've talked about the Levinasian ethics that is established, and you have implied a dimension of height, as it were, the question of power. But I'd like you to draw that out a little bit more, if you would. In the Levinasian model, of course, there is a dimension of height in the face of the other, in the face of alterity. There is something of the divine there. And of course, in Derrida's reading of that, there is an attempt to draw out a question of the ethico-political, not just the ethical as a first philosophy, but the ethico-political, which is about precisely the kind of suggestion of a metaphysical presence behind the face of the other. And in many ways, some of the instances that you have described with the dogs or their muzzles, there is a clear dimension of height that is in play. There is also with George Floyd on the ground, again, we have a dimension of height that is in play. And with with our contemporary technologies, sometimes there is a suggestion of horizontality in the way in which we are focused through an ocular perception of the face that is so different, as Freud reminds us, we don't smell ourselves in the same ways. We came up, we stood up, and we have a front now, which gives us that kind of sense of horizontality. So I was wondering if you could just say something about the dimension of height, its relation to power, the ethico-political. Thank you.
Thank you. Definitely, there is a topological dimension in the emergence of the face as a ethical interface and also as an ethical rampart in Levinas. It is clear in the way Levinas describes the face, and it is even clearer in the further development of Deleuze and Guattari. It is a topological understanding of the face that does not necessarily entail a reflection on the dialectics between the horizontal and the vertical. It entails mostly a reflection on the dialectics between the inside and the outside, and these plastic holes, the two holes of the eyes and the central hole of the mouth, that somehow regulate the passages that are both phenomenological and ethical between the inside and the outside of the face. So depending on how this topology of channels and holes and passages is interpreted, the face can be interpreted as a facade, as Levinas would say in Totalité et Infini, totality and infinity, or as a visage. And the problem of the phenomenology of Levinas is to exactly define what in this topology marks the difference and the passage from a way of using these holes of communication between inside and outside that bring about a visage, and what on the contrary brings about a facade. And the topology that Levinas eventually ends up describing is a topology that appears to be molded on a principle of vision, on the principle that there is an ancestral importance in the visus, in the fact that the face is in front of a gaze, in order to determine its ethical importance. This is something that we recognize also in the semantics of many words related to the face, and to the etymology itself of many words for the face in several languages. Visus in Latin, but also prosopon in Greek, which is etymologically what is in front of the eyes. So does this entail that what does not have any eyes or does not express any gaze is not entitled to a face? Are we bound to recognize the face uniquely in a gaze or in connection with a gaze? Now, this is not an answer to your question about a vertical horizontal topology, but is a question on what, it's an answer on what that dialectics and that topology entails. The gaze always entails a distance, and distance together with the gaze always implies an asymmetry. It is the kind of topological asymmetry that you were so skillfully describing in your question. So now can we, on the contrary, enlarge this phenomenological and ethical concept of the face so that it doesn't entail any kind of asymmetric topology and any kind of distance, which somehow brings about also an idea of power, but also an idea of subjugation? Can I see a face in a tree, for instance, although I cannot recognize a gaze in tree? Can I recognize a face in living animals that do not function in the same perceptual and sensorial way as mammals do not have the same organs, do not have eyes? A sea urchin, for instance, can I recognize a face in a sea urchin? You know, I used to eat them when I was in my pre-vegan life. But now I can recognize that they have a face, although they don't have any eyes, although the way in which they manifest their face is not exactly the way in which Levinas would consider it. It is a face linked with the idea of a non-suppressible singularity. Whatever interacts with me from this sphere of a redeemable singularity somehow works in the same way that human beings work when they show their faces. And as a consequence, this principle of the visage can be enlarged much more than certainly Levinas did. You know, that was the question that was asked to Levinas when he was dedicated a symposium in Cerisy-la-Salle in France. And someone from the audience, Derrida was also present, asked him, but, you know, can we see a visage in the snake, you know, in the snake of the Bible, for instance, you know, that to go back to the metaphysical dimension mentioned in your question. And Levinas answered, I don't know, you know, I have to think about it. And he didn't have time to think about it, but Derrida did, you know, and he developed the question in the wonderful book, The Animal That Therefore I Am, which in French is also, of course, The Animal That Therefore I Follow, L'animal que je donc je suis. But in that text too, there is a limitation of the principle, the ethical principle of the face, to a sort of a scopic relation, or to a sensorial relation that doesn't involve the other senses and excludes, for instance, living beings that are not shaped like human beings. It is perhaps with Donna Haraway that this principle is really expanded, to include also other forms of life that have shared the same metaphysics of singularity, and therefore must somehow, if one adheres to this philosophy, must be encompassed in this general principle of the face. That also has as a consequence the fact that the phenomenology of Levinas is somehow reversed, meaning that we do not see an ethical unviolability in those that have a face, but we do give a face to those or that to which we recognize an ethical unviolability. So nature as a whole, for instance, or landscape as a whole can have a face.
You have a question from Akira Lippitt, who's actually going to be giving a lecture of his own later in this afternoon. So he says, thank you for the wonderful lecture. So his question, his concern is that Pinocchio here, and perhaps more in Agamben, is being mobilized as a figure for humanity, perhaps even exemplary humanity. But isn't he the pre-human, the not yet human, and wouldn't his morality need to be understood as such?
Agamben's interpretation seeks to turn Pinocchio and this phenomenon of the growing nose into an argument to define humanity and what is consubstantial in humanity in relation to the difficult dialectics between truth and lie. But at the same time, I received this interpretation with interest, but I'm much more interested in the motility of Pinocchio's nose. The fact that it is a piece of wood that grows, and this growing of the piece of wood is even before its connection with any discourse on lying or truth, a sign of motility, autonomous motility, which is also something that defines humanity and at the same time defines life, although in different ways. That can define living beings, not only human beings, but also other like animal species, that defines plants, that defines viruses as well. So I understand the philosophical purpose of Agamben, but I would say that when Collodi reflects on the relation between muzzles and masks, is probably reflecting on something that doesn't really pertain uniquely to the human intercourse, to the enunciation and the reception of a lie. It is somehow pointing at the intimate lie that precedes any exterior lie, which is the lie of having a face, the lie of being endowed with this face that Collodi, in these notes that I've mentioned in the beginning of my lecture, considers like a mask on a muzzle. Now, this is quite a provocation in Collodi, but I want to interpret this provocation as a suggestion to think about the face as a cultural lie covering a muzzle that we don't want to see, and especially we don't want to recognize in other living beings. You see, there were many, this is a little bit trivial, but let me say it. There were many recipes in Italian food. When I'm Italian, I have to talk about food at some stage. There are many recipes, there were many Italian recipes, including the head of animals, the faces of animals. Even in butchers, you could buy the head of animals. Now the faces of animals and the head of animals have disappeared. from Italian recipes, from markets, from food. Why? Well, because we don't want to see their faces when we actually eat them. We want to actually forget that they had a faces, that they had a life, a singular life. So this is a very trivial example, but to see that there is such a taboo, very spread taboo about these ancestral and I would say definitory violence of the human species towards the other animal species.
Hi, thank you for a wonderful lecture. My name is Negar. I teach here at Duke University. I have a question with regards to NFTs and the digital masks that or digital images that are now being created and traded as as avatars, for various platforms like Twitter and so forth. So tens of thousands of dollars are spent on these cartoon character images, not of the people themselves, but they're used as avatars on Facebook and Twitter and so forth. And they're being traded on basically on things that are similar to blockchain platforms. So decentralized, autonomous organizations versus governmental networks, right? This is happening in a time when we're also recognizing that trees are connected to each other in these networks of roots, that mycelial networks spread across the surface of the earth, and plants and trees are constantly speaking to each other, giving each other information, supporting each other, protecting familial relations, warning each other off. And so I really wonder if, I see some correspondences between these two things happening in this moment, right? The way that we are organizing ourselves as a society building that's happening on the digital network, where we're also recognizing that kind of society on the level of the earth. I'm wondering if anything like this, if you see this, a precedent to this in a different time, a different age, a different moment, does this trading of faces on a autonomous network, faces that are not ours, for example, has this happened in another time, another place? Thank you.
Thank you. This is a fascinating question. It's actually on a topic I'm thinking a lot about, and I don't have a definitive answer, not even a tentative answer. What I can say is that it's true that non-fungible tokens are used more and more to protect singularity from the ubiquitous power of the digital machine to create perfect copies. This has been applied to several objects, but I guess more and more will be applied to the face. Our face, our biological face, is unredeemably and ineluctably singular. It is not so clear to explain why, but that is probably something that was adaptive. It was adaptive for us and for other species to have singularity imprinted, embodied in their own bodies, and especially concentrated in the face. You might call it a neo-Aristotelian interpretation of the singularity of the face. But at the same time, our digital representations of the face work in a way that is unparalleled. There is an unmatched ability now to construct digital representations of faces that do not make any clear indexical reference to any biological, a socially recognized face. And this evolution has been very rapid. Generative adversarial networks would not exist up to like 2017, 2018. The article by the US scholar that created this algorithm dates from 2014, Ian Goodfellow, which is now they're responsible for artificial intelligence at Apple, if I'm not wrong. So the evolution has been very rapid, and but astonishing in a way that now, as human beings, we cannot tell the difference between a facial image and the digital image of a face that has been created by a GAN, a generative adversarial network, and the digital image of a face that has been produced by taking a digital photo of the face of someone ontologically present in front of us, or at least, socially present in front of us. It is only other machines now that can tell the difference. So in relation to the past, certainly you're very familiar with the work of Carlo Ginzburg on Giovanni Morelli and this attempt at discovering clues to distinguish the fake from the truth in the art market. So in the past, there were many forgeries and many fakes would circulate in the art market, for instance. But now it is as if there were millions of forgers constantly active all the time, every moment, every second, with the only purpose of creating fakes. And as humans, we cannot stem that tide of fake anymore alone. We need other machines. So in order to check the veracity of a digital image of a face, we need a machine. And we need to delegate somehow, not to a method like Morelli did, but to an algorithm. An algorithm which contains a black box, a black matter, an equation that is impossible for us to control. So we have to trust the algorithms that tell us that a fake is a fake and that a truth is a truth. A little bit like we would trust gods. The algorithmic sublime is called by someone. That makes us humans very insecure and unstable. And somehow we are living the insecurity of the Anthropocene through the spreading of viruses. But we are also living the insecurity of the digital Anthropocene through the spreading of the fake. The fake and the virus are very similar, I believe, in some of their manifestations and evolutions. So non-fungible tokens are perhaps the ultimate remedy, the ultimate device to certify the uniqueness of something. But certifying the uniqueness of something is not certifying the singularity of something. Singularity and uniqueness are not the same thing. The uniqueness is certified by non-fungible tokens is a numeric, digital, again, uniqueness. So it is a way of somehow securing the fact that something cannot be copied, something cannot be faked, but does so in a way that is not geometric or topological, in the same way that we recognize the singularity of a face. It is an arithmetic, mathematical way of encircling and securing singularity. So I think that NFTs applied to the human body and to, for the moment, to images of the human body, but perhaps in the future also to the human body itself, are the ultimate consequence of the crisis of the singularity, of the illusion of singularity that has been cultivated for centuries in human cultures. And the way to react to it, in my opinion, is not to entrench our singularity by a numeric digital fortress. It is to embrace, on the contrary, the fact that we share the singularity with other living beings. It is not through protecting our digital identity that will survive. It is through recognize that this identity is a construction somehow built to the detriment of non-human identities. At least this is the way that I see, exactly as I see the only way out of the virus spreading and the pandemic catastrophes, not in the dream of eliminating viruses from the planet, but reestablishing a coexistence equilibrium with it. At the same time, we have to reestablish a coexistence equilibrium with the fake. The fake has always been part of human life, human societies, but now we have lost that equilibrium.
We are out of time. I'm sorry, that went really fast. Massimo Leone, thank you for a wonderful lecture and for a stimulating discussion.